Hello, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I am Katie Dyson, Assistant Director of Engagement Programs here at the Art Institute of Chicago. I am thrilled you'll be joining us this afternoon to learn about the work of the museum's incredible conservation team. As we begin, a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this afternoon's conversation, Kim Muir and Allison Langley. Kim Muir joined the Department of Conservation and Science in 2005. Her work focuses on the technical study and scientific analysis of the Art Institute's paintings. She has contributed to several online scholarly catalogs, including volumes on Claude Monet, Edouard Manet, and James McNeill Whistler. Allison Langley is the Director of Paintings and Frames Conservation at the Art Institute of Chicago. Since joining the museum in 2002, her treatments and research initiatives have focused primarily on late 19th century and early 20th century paintings. She has published on the artworks of George Seurat, Pablo Picasso, Amedeo Modigliani, and Mark Rothko, among others. Now, please join me in welcoming my colleagues Kim and Allison to the stage to share their discoveries from the Conservation Lab.
Good afternoon, everyone. We thought the idea of ghost paintings would be a fun and seasonal way of exploring some of the imaging methods we use to look below the surface of paintings to learn more about artists, painting materials, and techniques. Conservation imaging can reveal a variety of insights into the hidden layers of a painting. We don't see actual ghosts, but we do see ghostly evidence of abandoned paintings, eliminated figures, moving haystacks and forgotten boats, for example, and a wide range of mysterious changes to forms. These are always really fun discoveries, so we'll talk about a few specific cases, but first we want to give you an overview of two of the most important imaging techniques we use: infrared reflectography, which we tend to call IR, and X-radiography, or X-rays.
So basically with these techniques, we're taking advantage of the ways that different wavelengths of radiation interact with the materials of the painting. So today, you may recall your electromagnetic spectrum from science class. And today we're going to be looking beyond the visible range of light and ultraviolet light to X-rays and infrared light, as Allison mentioned. And these are techniques that will sort of penetrate the surface of the painting and allow us to see layers underneath. And the materials will either absorb or transmit this radiation, depending on a number of factors like the chemical composition, the thickness, the density of those materials. And so I think if we jump into some examples.
The infrared camera that we use is similar to those used by the military or security firms for night vision. However, in the museum world, we have a range of special filters that we can add to the camera to look specifically for underdrawings. The process of IR reflectography involves illuminating a painting on an easel using photolights. The camera produces an IR image on a screen that we can see live, so we can actually scan a painting with the camera to see what we can detect under the surface. And then if we do want to capture an image, we can capture digital shots from using the camera, using special software. Here you see a typical setup using our Goodrich IR camera. The painting on the easel is a still life painting by Jan Bruegel, painted between 1605 and 1615. IR works really well for finding graphite and charcoal underdrawing. In this black and white detail from the Bruegel, the paint used to create the flowers appears translucent when we look at the surface with the IR camera. And as a result, we can see the black lines that Bruegel used to plan the composition. He's drawn in the flowers, delineating a lot of the details, and even drew in the little insects that we see on the leaves. In this case, Bruegel seems to have used the underdrawing as a sort of loose guide, because we can also see that the painted outlines of the flowers don't follow the drawing lines exactly.
Archibald Motley was born in New Orleans, but actually spent most of his life here in Chicago and actually studied painting at the School of the Art Institute. I'm going to be focusing on the painting on the right, but we're also fortunate to have a self-portrait in our collection as well. And these are always really interesting for us when the artist sort of depicts themselves at work, because it gives us a little bit of insight into their process. For example, the pigments that they were using and how they laid out their palette. So this work, Nightlife, from around 1943, is a painting that Motley did that depicts this bustling sort of nightclub scene with people socializing, dancing. Apparently, I think I read somewhere they're doing the Lindy Hop, if that means anything to you. And I think it's really interesting that this kind of really energetic composition was planned out using a very precise and sort of systematic underdrawing, which we're seeing in the infrared image on the right. And well, just to zoom in a little bit more closely, you can see that each figure was sort of carefully outlined, and even every bottle and label on the bar was, precisely delineated. He did make a few sort of corrections to the drawing as he went, and you can sort of see in the area of that figure who sort of slumped over the bar that there are a number of sort of parallel lines there where he was sort of working out the perspective of the bar. And we can compare this kind of really precise compositional planning with an artist like Paul Cézanne, who, when he did use underdrawing, and he didn't always, tended to create sort of a very loose, rough idea of the composition, which he may or may not have followed when he painted the work. So a couple of years ago, we were actually able to study all of our Cézanne paintings for the exhibition that we held in 2022. And we found that some of the works, he didn't use any underdrawing, and they were just sort of painted directly on the canvas. Some had sort of just the most cursory underdrawing, a few lines. And other works, like the Bay of Marseille, seen from L'Estaque, which I'm showing here from the 1880s, he planned it out with a fairly extensive underdrawing. So looking at the infrared image, you can see that sort of the major features of the composition were all sort of mapped out, but he uses a lot of kind of very rough repeating lines as he's sort of figuring out the edges of forms. Some parts, like the shrubbery, he's just sort of put the most cursory kind of curving lines to sort of serve as a placeholder for where the foliage is going to be. The mountains in the background were, actually, let's just move ahead and look at a detailed area. So this is showing sort of the lower left quadrant. And you can see that the mountains in the background, again, drawing with sort of repeated lines, and they were done fairly accurately to sort of the topography of the location. But when it came to painting it, he sort of shifted things a little and compressed the space. Also, if you look sort of at the peak of the mountain, just a little bit to the right of center, that's where there's a church up there. It's the Basilica of Notre Dame de la Garde. And you can see that he sort of just used the quickest scribble to indicate that, which really wasn't even kind of developed in any more detail when he painted over it as well. And if you sort of follow down from that, you'll see that there's a kind of a vertical line from the church going down into the foreground of the painting. And this seems to have been sort of like a guideline that he used to determine sort of the placement of that prominent chimney stack in the foreground, which itself you can see he was sort of, playing around with where that was going to be positioned.
So on to Fernand Léger. He was a 20th century French artist, painter, sculptor, filmmaker who worked in Paris. And he painted in a sort of a personal style of cubism that was sort of mechanical, almost machine-made-looking images. To support himself in his early days of painting, he was actually an architectural draftsman. And I think you see that influence in how he planned his compositions. So in the case of our composition in blue from 1921, there's actually a fully numbered and lettered grid that sits below the surface. And in this slide, I've outlined what we can see with the infrared camera in red on the infrared image on the right, and on the left is a detail of the lower left corner where I think you can see the cursive writing of RSTU going down with some of the lines. Grids were used by a lot of artists, for hundreds of years to scale up or transfer compositions from one medium to another. So, for example, to transfer an image in a drawing onto a painted canvas or a photo, for example. They also use them to accurately repeat an image over and over if they wanted to make several versions of it. And sometimes they would even use it to reverse an image, so you'd see the mirror image. Grids can often be drawn on canvases or supporting material. That also artists often use string, where they could pin it over the image and make a grid-like surface and then transfer it square by square. And interestingly, there are a number of versions of this composition. We have a drawing in our collection, and you'll notice it's actually reversed from the painting. There's also another version of our painting at the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is slightly smaller. So clearly Léger was interested in repeating this composition a number of times. We're still kind of trying to figure out which came first and how this all worked out, but it was kind of an unexpected find to find something like this underneath this modern painting.
So moving on to X-radiography, this is basically showing our setup in our conservation exam room and sort of how we X-ray a painting. So the X-ray tube is positioned in a lead-lined box underneath the tabletop surface. And it's directly underneath that plexiglass window that you can see that's exactly the size of the films that we use to capture the X-rays. So the painting is positioned face up over that window, and the film is in a light-tight envelope. It's placed on the surface of the painting. And so we capture a film and then reposition until we've sort of captured the entire surface of the painting. The control panel is sort of where we set the conditions, the voltage, the time that we're going to capture for. And I think you can get a sense from the sort of nifty dials and gauges on that this isn't exactly state-of-the-art equipment. It's actually an old dental unit from the 1960s that we use. But it's definitely served us well over the decades.
So occasionally we have paintings in our collection that are too large to bring to the conservation studio to X-ray. And we're fortunate that our very old X-ray unit is on wheels, and we can roll it and the control panel into the galleries to take X-rays of some of our largest works. Obviously, we do this after we're closed and nobody's around. Here you see our Picabia at Tonisel, which is a 10-foot by 10-foot painting. And we took it to the galleries one evening and set up this X-ray table in one of the second floor galleries of the modern wing. We placed the painting on top of sort of wood rods that hold it stable above the X-ray table, and then we move the X-ray table beneath it, square by square by square, or really rectangle by rectangle by rectangle. In this case, it took 5 of us to do 5 hours to X-ray this painting. It took 98 sheets of medical X-ray film, and the one kind of funny part of this is we cannot move the processor that develops the X-ray film. It is on the other side of the building. So during that 5 hours, we had to take turns running back and forth with the X-ray film to develop this. But it is nice to have an X-ray unit on wheels that we can take into the galleries, because some of our largest paintings we wouldn't have X-rays of otherwise. Once we take the X-ray films, we look at them on a giant light box, and we're lucky we have a wall-size light box in conservation. Here you see our Caillebotte Paris street scene rainy day. We are putting the X-rays here up on the light box to make sure we have captured every inch of the painting. And then we scan them on a flatbed scanner to make a digital image of each X-ray film. And then we use software to make a digital composite. And so those composites are what we can really use to do research, look at closely on the computer, that's what appears in our publications online or in books and obviously in our slideshows. So it is a little bit of an old-fashioned system, but it works incredibly well, and the X-ray film gives us incredibly high resolution. We are in the process of purchasing a new digital X-ray system in the next 12 to 18 months, so we're extremely excited about that. We'll have a new X-ray source, we'll retire our dental unit, and have a new sort of digital capture plate, so we won't have to, use wet development materials that we use now for our old medical X-ray film. So stay tuned for more of that.
So this painting of St. Andrew by Pompeo Batone, we thought it would be an interesting example to sort of walk you through some of the features that you see in an X-ray. So as I mentioned before, the X-ray will either be transmitted or blocked or absorbed by the materials in the painting, depending on chemical composition, density, et cetera. And so sort of in contrast to the infrared reflectography that we were talking about, the X-rays really penetrate through the entire structure of the painting. So we get information about the support, whether it was painted on a canvas or a fabric support versus a solid panel. We see the paint and ground layers, again, depending on what they're made of. So, for example, carbon-based black pigments, like we've just seen show up so well with infrared reflectography, are actually transparent to the X-rays, so they appear dark on the film. But other kinds of pigments that are based on sort of heavier elements, metals like lead white or copper-containing greens, will absorb the X-rays and appear white or lighter on the X-ray. And so we get sort of a really beautiful image of the painting, the paint application. It can also reveal later restorations, as well as damages and other kinds of conservation issues in the support or the paint layers. Now, all of these sort of different aspects are superimposed on one layer, so it can be a little bit tricky to read an X-ray and to sort of understand what is happening below the surface at which layer within the paint layers. So it does take a bit of experience to read them, and also to interpret sort of what's going on beneath the surface. And also, it needs to be combined with a really good understanding of the surface of the painting as well. So, so looking at this painting, it's kind of a rare example for a painting this age to be in such pristine condition. It was painted almost 300 years ago. And we can see that it's on its original support. So it's a wooden strainer that the canvas is attached to. And in the lower right, you can see from the back one of those corner joins. And it also has its original hand-forged nails, which you can see in that other detail there. And it's really unusual that a painting of this age hasn't been through a lot of conservation treatments over the years. It's only ever had a minimal treatment, and we can tell by looking at the very good condition of the tacking edges that it's probably never even been taken off the stretcher. And of course, I think the brushwork in this painting is really beautiful. It's a very sort of assured way of painting. There aren't a lot of changes. The artist knew exactly what he was doing. And you get a really beautiful sense of the brushwork. So I have a detail of the head here. And you can see that especially well in the highlighted areas where he's used sort of built it up in thicker brush strokes and used a lot of lead white containing pigment, which of course blocks the X-rays. And so you really get a sense of even the different paintbrushes that he was using, including some very fine ones for, the very fine strands of hair and the eyelashes, which I think are really beautiful. As I mentioned, X-rays can also reveal damages, which sometimes carry interesting information about the history of a work of art. So here we're looking at Claude Monet's Irises, which is a pretty large-scale painting on canvas. that it's believed that this was a study done out of doors for Monet's grand water lilies project. You're probably familiar with the water lilies paintings that he worked on later in his life that are these sort of vast, sweeping canvases. But he took, relatively smaller canvases. I think this one is about 2 by 2 meters, out to his gardens and created some of these studies. And the fact that he never signed or dated the work makes us think that he probably didn't consider it a finished work. The sort of signature that you're seeing down on the lower right is actually an estate stamp that was applied by the family to sort of verify things that were left in Monet's studio after his death. And so this canvas was actually sort of hidden away and really forgotten about among a number of other ones, which I think it's hard to believe that you could forget about a trove of Monet paintings. But again, these were not necessarily finished works that he was selling. And there are some reports from the time that these works had sort of been hidden away during the Second World War, and German soldiers had sort of fired on the shed that they were being stored in and sort of inadvertently caused some damages to the canvas, probably not knowing that they were in there. And I'll just grab the pointer. And so we think that this may account for some of the damages that we're seeing, including this sort of star-shaped tear in the canvas and a smaller damage over here. The X-ray is also really incredible just in terms of the picture that it gives you of Monet's brushwork. If you've seen this work in person, you know that it's a really thick, encrusted surface. He was applying paint incredibly thickly in these kind of gestural, highly textured brush strokes, and over a considerable period of time. So one layer was allowed to dry before he sort of built up the painting even more. And you can see it sort of culminates in this massive brushwork that almost completely obscures the stretcher. You can maybe just sort of make out a faint hint of the horizontal crossbar going through the middle. This is a work as well, I think, that is really interesting to look at in the galleries because of the size of it and the way that the light sort of rakes across the surface. You can really see a lot of those underlying strokes that were later covered over with paint because the texture is still apparent even though they've been covered over. This work is one of 6 panel paintings by Giovanni di Paolo that we have in the collection, and it depicts scenes from the life of St. John the Baptist. So in the center there, you can see an image of the back of the painting, which shows that it's painted on a wooden panel. And the sort of lattice of vertical and horizontal bars that you're seeing on the back and that are also showing up in the X-ray is actually part of an old restoration treatment. So this is called a cradle, and it's something that they did in the past to help prevent warping of the panel. It sort of fixed it in place, and the hope was to sort of make the panel less responsive to changes in relative humidity of the environment. Here's a detail from the front of the painting. The X-ray is actually pretty low contrast because this work is painted with egg tempera, and it's applied in very thin layers of paint. Egg tempera, you cannot sort of build up the same way you can oil paint to get sort of thick brushwork. But I think you can sort of start to make out the drapery of that figure on the left side, dressed in the blue and yellow. And the other thing I wanted to point out as well is the sort of lighter circles and longer channels that you're seeing are actually the result of damage that was caused by wood-boring insects who sort of ate their way through the panel. And those have been filled up, and that's why they appear white in the X-ray. And you can also see them from the back as well, some of those channels, because the panel was sort of thinned down from the back, so a lot of the material was removed before the cradle was added.
I'll just add that we are currently have 2 of the 6 panels in conservation, and they're getting cleaned by our colleague Elizabeth Wigfield. This is going to be a multi-year restoration project that we're really excited about. At some point next year, we'll have the 2 cleaned panels installed with 2 of the uncleaned panels in the galleries. So look for some, I think, interesting discussions and public programming about that. These are the 6 panels we have are part of 12 panels that came from a 15th century Sienese church, and there's a lot of interest by all the collections that own different parts of these of this larger construction about what we're finding and what it means. We don't know exactly where they were used in this church. They may have been part of a piece of furniture or doors. So it's a really kind of exciting project to have time to treat something that's sort of this old and a little bit mysterious. So anyway, look out for that.
So in many ways, these 2 works that I'm showing here couldn't be more different. The Whistler painting, the coast scene on the left, is actually a tiny 5 by 8 inch wood panel painting that was quickly painted on the spot. It probably didn't take Whistler very long to dash that one off. And over on the right, Suguharu Fujita's portrait of Emily Crane Chadbourne is a huge painting on canvas. It's roughly 3 by 5 feet, and it was likely carried out over many stages, taking a lot longer than that to complete. But it is interesting to compare these 2 works to take a look at the way that artists primed their canvases. So in this case, I'm thinking about the ground layers that were applied directly to the supports to prepare them for painting. And although these artists were working about 40 years apart, they both certainly could have purchased commercially primed canvases from an art supply store. That was certainly typical practice. Many of their contemporaries tended to do that at this time. But each of them sort of specifically chose preparation layers and methods that were specifically suited to the effects that they were trying to achieve in their paintings. So Whistler is an artist who was very interested in exploring sort of mood and color harmonies in his compositions, and he worked with very thin veils of paint, sort of applying and removing and keeping it sort of very thin and transparent. And in the coast scene painting, I think you can sort of get a sense that he's basically created the different bands of the beach, the water, the sky, using horizontal strokes of that really thin fluid paint that are just sort of drawn from one side of the panel to the other. And he had prepared this panel with a sort of grayish colored ground that he kind of partially sanded down or abraded a little bit and exposed small patches of the wood panel underneath. And I think you can maybe start to get a sense of seeing those layers through the very thinnest paint applications, the sort of gray and the warmish pink of the ground. And I think it's interesting to see how the tonality of those layers showing through sort of depends on the color of the paint that was applied on top. The X-ray, I would probably describe as one of the least interesting ones that I've ever looked at. And again, this is because the paint is so thinly applied. I think if you maybe squint very carefully, you can just see the thickest paint, which is that white sail up in the distance. But basically what we're seeing is the wood panel, and we do get a very nice image of the wood grain. But we can also learn a little bit about Whistler's process. You can see there are some sort of vertical scratches that show that he sanded the panel before he applied that ground, probably to give a little bit of tooth to the panel. And he also applied narrow strips of wood along the top and the bottom before he finished painting it. And this may have been done to sort of expand the height of the painting to fit it into a particular frame, possibly. So looking in contrast at the Fujita, Fujita was a Japanese-born painter who spent a lot of time studying and working in Paris, and he sort of combined Eastern and Western painting techniques. And so I think this work is really interesting because it combines a number of different media. So there's paint, there's ink applied with both a pen and a brush. The tiled background is actually squares of tarnished silver leaf. And he also used some shell gold in some select places. And what the X-ray is showing us is that all of those layers that I've just described are very transparent to the X-rays. And again, what we're seeing is this artist-applied ground that was applied in these kind of very gestural strokes, probably using some kind of knife or spatula type instrument to kind of spackle that ground on the surface. And it's quite thick. The surface was sanded down to a very smooth, hard finish, and that sort of made the support more suitable to the gilding process and to this very precise technique of building up the painting or the picture.
So this painting, this 1915 painting by Picasso, comes from a period often called synthetic cubism. It's one of many large, colorful portraits in bold planes of color, patterns, and texture that has the different colored areas superimposed, so it looks like a collage, but it's all made with paint. And you can see Picasso in his studio from this period with a number of sort of similar works in the background. The paint has an incredibly bumpy surface, and one of our questions was, what is making this surface so bumpy? We know Picasso liked to add things to his paint, sand in particular, so we were curious if we could figure out what was going on. So we took an X-ray of it, and here's the X-ray of the painting. It shows the ground preparation. As Kim mentioned, these can appear in many different ways. This is not a commercial ground. This is an artist-applied ground where he's used a really wide brush to just sweep it kind of loosely across the surface. But it also shows a lot of wonderful little changes throughout the composition, and I won't go into great detail here about those, but I think if you look at the two images, you can look at the hats, look at the face, you can see there's sort of radical changes to some of the forms we see in the finished painting. There's also some interesting parallel striped markings that we see in the X-ray that disappear from the final image. There's kind of too many changes to go through right now, but clearly Picasso was working this out while he was painting the canvas. But what we really were curious to see was the sand, and the sand in this case is added into the white ground. So he must have prepared this himself, stirred in sand and rocks, and in the X-ray detail, hopefully you can see the little tiny spots are all little individual sand particles in rocks. These details don't quite do this painting justice, so if you go in our galleries on the third floor and look at this painting, notice the sand and the bumpiness, because it's really kind of intriguing once you see it in the natural light of the third floor galleries.
So this is Renoir's Two Sisters on the Terrace, and this is definitely one of the favorites of the collection, I think. Here we're looking at the X-ray, and just by way of explanation, I had mentioned before with the Battone St. Andrew painting, it being in pristine condition. This work, on the other hand, has received some conservation treatment. It's been lined. That's a process of basically gluing reinforcing canvas to the back of the original canvas. It's something that was done quite routinely in the past. We tend not to use that procedure much anymore, only for very special circumstances. In this case, unfortunately, they replaced the original stretcher with this spring stretcher, which has some metallic elements at the corners there and the crossbar, which is sort of dominating the X-ray in an unfortunate way. But leaving that aside, this is a work that Renoir made a few sort of small changes as he worked on it. And again, in contrast to the Battone painting with that beautiful face that was sort of, rendered in a very assured way, Renoir really sort of was rethinking the faces of these two figures and reworking them. And I've got a couple of details that sort of show this. I think when you look at these kinds of changes in an X-ray, it can be a little disconcerting. The child at the top, you could see those dark patches on her cheeks are where Renoir actually removed some of the thick paint that he had applied to the face there. And then he reworked those areas using a very sort of thin and translucent paint that relied more on the reflective properties of the white ground to create sort of more radiance and luminance in the cheeks there. And the woman at the bottom, again, he was reworking that face in different ways, and perhaps just to orient you, again, you can sort of see the dark marks of the lips and the nostrils there. And if you look sort of above where her eyes are, you can see there's this sort of floating eyeball that suggests that earlier on the woman was sort of maybe looking in a different direction or had a different expression on her face. We hope we haven't ruined this beautiful painting for any of you.
So Beaufort Delaney was an American modernist painter. He's remembered for his work with the Harlem Renaissance in the 1930s and 40s in New York. He later moved to Paris in the 1950s and moved to a more abstract expressionist style. This vibrant and haunting self-portrait dates from 1944, and you see a photo of the artist at work on the right with a similar cap. So I often like to tell people that looking at an X-ray is a bit like looking at an artist's handwriting. Artists apply paint in very distinctive ways, and this is readily visible in X-rays, as you've probably gathered through some of the slides so far. Here you see how the artist used thick, expressive dabs and swirls of paint to block in the forms. The dark lines around the edges of the figure indicate that Delaney outlined this form with black paint first and then painted in the clothing and the face and the landscape around these lines afterward. He filled in the colors, he layered the pigments wet and wet on the surface. It's quite an active composition. He made a few tweaks to the hat, which you might be able to see. It was originally sort of a small rounded beanie, and then he's added the pointed cap. He also seems to have made some changes to the neckline or the collar of what he was wearing. There's the dark line on the neck that you see in the X-ray and on the painting that indicates a change. And clearly he was kind of working out the composition as he was painting. In contrast, Edward Hopper's Nighthawks could not be more different. Painted in 1942, this enigmatic and compelling composition is very tightly organized and was very well planned. In the photos at the right, you see Hopper at work in his studio in Manhattan, and you see some of his materials sort of artfully arranged on a dresser that was in his studio. The X-ray for Nighthawks is as quiet and mysterious as the painting. It suggests a meticulously planned composition. It's painted thinly and directly on the canvas with no alterations whatsoever. Hopper was a slow and methodical artist, and he once wrote, "It takes a long time for an idea to strike, then I have to think about it for a long time. I don't start painting until I have it all worked out in my head. I'm all right when I get to the easel." This X-ray is a really good example of an artist who knew exactly what they wanted to paint and made no changes in the course of painting. It also shows how a really plain and maybe, even boring X-ray can actually be extremely informative in its own way. It can be as fascinating as a really busy X-ray full of changes because you really get insight into how an artist thinks and how they paint and how they plan their artworks. However, it is really fun to find surprising things under X-rays. So now we're going to show you a few more kind of unexpected things we have found while studying our collection. First up is Amedeo Modigliani. He was an Italian artist who worked in Paris. He was a poor and struggling artist and had a very short life. He often painted on top of other paintings. Some he salvaged from flea markets, some he took from his artist friends' studios and repurposed. Sometimes he even painted on top of his own works, flipping them upside down or sideways or painting on the backs of them. He was always sort of struggling for money and materials. So our Modigliani Lipschitz portrait shows Jacques and Bertha Lipschitz. Jacques was a sculptor of the period and a friend of Modigliani, and he was having a lot more artistic success at the time that this was painted. So he commissioned Modigliani to do a portrait of him and his wife as an excuse to give Modigliani money, because he wouldn't take money from any of his friends. In his biography, Lipschitz described Modigliani's working process for the portrait, which was initially based on the couple's wedding photo, which you see on the right. There were 2 days of sittings, one for preparatory sketches on paper, and there are about 10 or 11 sketches for this painting and other collections. And then the next day he came back and he painted the painting. So on the day of the painting, Modigliani reportedly painted for a few hours with speed and precision, according to Lipschitz, with the canvas propped on a chair. And then he called it finished after a couple of hours. Lipschitz asked if he could continue to work more on the canvas, inventing excuses because he wanted to offer the artist more money. Reportedly, Modigliani answered, "If you want me to spoil it, I can continue." But he did go back, he took the painting with him, and he did continue working on it for a few more days. And looking at the painting in person, and as well as the X-ray, we can see that most of this work really focused on the figure of Bertha. Her face is built up with layers of additional paint. When you compare it to the way that Jacques' face is painted, he's painted quite thinly, and a lot of the ground layers sort of showing through his face and the shadows. But she definitely was an area that he worked on. He altered the positioning of her head and kind of softened her features a bit. But of course, what you can't miss here is this great third figure that mysteriously appeared in the X-ray. In his memoir, Lipschitz mentioned that Modigliani came with an old canvas, which he liked because it already had some preparation on it. What we did not expect to find was this figure peeking out when we X-rayed the painting. This is probably one of Modigliani's flea market finds, although we're not 100% sure. He seems to have had an older painting that he cut down, restretched, and painted a white ground on top of the earlier image. But the tacking edges still show the colors of the underlying painting. So there's like greens and yellows and blues that are unrelated to the Lipschitz portrait. The background is completely hidden. If you look at this painting in the galleries, you won't see this third figure. And so it is kind of a ghostly presence. If you know she's there, I mean, most people don't know she's there, so now she will haunt you next time you look at this painting in the galleries. And I have to just say this is one of my favorite X-rays because I just love the way it looks like this figure's photobombing the couple, kind of sneaking into the background of the picture. And it just makes me smile every time I see this one.
So Diego Rivera is probably better known as a large-scale muralist, but he spent some time working in Paris in the 1910s among a community of avant-garde artists, and he developed his own brand of cubism, as you can see in this work titled Marevna. It's a portrait of Maria Vorobiev, known as Marevna, who was a Russian-born painter and writer and Rivera's lover at the time. So the X-ray is very complicated. There's a lot going on here, and part of it is related to the way that he built up the portrait of Marevna using these sort of overlapping forms and making some changes as he went along, but also because we're looking at two paintings superimposed. So you can see that there is another figure oriented sort of 180 degrees. The head you can see up near the bottom of the painting. And the other painting, the earlier painting, is actually painted on the back of the canvas. So this is what it looks like from the reverse. It's also a portrait of a woman sitting in a chair, but of course a very different style, having been painted a couple of years earlier. I think this lineup of photos is pretty amazing because, I mean, I think you get a sense of the likeness. Marevna was sort of known for this bob hairstyle and bangs. And I love this detail because you can see that Rivera used sort of a comb-like device that he dragged through the wet paint to create the bangs. So this is Boy with Picture, which was painted by Edouard Manet, and this work has been cut down and reworked by the artist. You can see the tacking edges around the edges of the painting. The work was treated in the 1960s, and at that time they turned out the original tacking edges and lined the painting. So that's what we're seeing, that sort of border around the edges would originally have been folded over and the tacks placed there. But now we're seeing this sort of on the surface of the painting, although it's covered by the frame when the work is exhibited. We know that this was part of a larger composition that Manet exhibited in 1863 and again in 1867. And we have evidence of the composition from an etching that Manet created and that was published in 1862. So it's a larger multi-figure composition showing an itinerant family. The composition, as you can see, is in reverse as a result of the printing process. And actually, two other fragments from the painting survive. The male figure you can see, and then a small still life from the bottom right. And these actually just surfaced on the market a few years ago. And we know from some reviews of the exhibitions that Manet showed these work, the painting and the larger painting, in that it sort of received some negative criticism. The critics didn't love it, but they did sort of single out the boy with the picture as the best part of the painting. And so that may be why he sort of preferenced that part of the painting rather than the mother and child below. The woman, unfortunately, did not make the cut. And in the X-ray, you can see that her head is, or most of her head is sort of embedded underneath the shirt of the boy. And if you just sort of focus on the bottom edge of the actual painting on the left there, you can see a little bit of the flesh tones of her cheeks and her hair. We also, over on the right, have a little bit of the arm of the male musician. And then on the three sides, you're seeing a bit of the of blue paint, which is actually a sky background of the original painting. This is a detail of that area in raking light. So when we shine the light at sort of an angle across the surface of the painting, it really gives you a sense of the topography, the surface texture. And it shows us that Manet actually scraped out the woman's hair. There's a real discernible sort of step down in the level of the paint in that area. And looking over at the X-ray, you can see there's sort of a lighter halo just outside of her head. And so all of this suggests to me that as he was developing this as a smaller painting, he at first tried to cover over the hair using a lead white rich paint. So that's what we're seeing in the X-ray. And then possibly because the hair was so dark, it was still showing through, and he worried about it showing through the white shirt of the boy. So that's why he scraped that out. And he was less concerned with the flesh tones. And now that you know this is here, if you look at the painting in the gallery, you can really see those sort of pinkish tones showing through the surface.
So back to Picasso. Artists paint over their paintings for a lot of different reasons. One of the most playful artists to do this repeatedly was Picasso. Almost every painting we have in our collection has something below, which is kind of interesting and surprising. He was incredibly prolific and incredibly creative, and was often painting on top of his own paintings as he was changing his style or experimenting with new techniques. This is Nude with Picture from 1906, painted when Picasso was quite young. And this painting has an entirely different woman underneath it. There's a standing female form with arms raised and elbows bent. In this case, it's interesting because the very thinly upper layers of the final painting go almost transparent, so the X-ray really just shows us what's below. And it was a young girl, and she actually had sort of a tall red picture to her right. One thing that's really interesting about Picasso repainting over his paintings is he rarely ever put an intermediary ground layer or scraped away the earlier works. He liked to leave little hints of what was below, or even reuse parts of what was below. So in this case, the shading on the hip of the woman with the picture is actually the dark red showing through from the underlying layer, and a picture in the first image. And he does this repeatedly, often kind of using outlines or forms from one painting on the next painting, and then on the next painting. In this case, there's also this wonderful little squiggle that's at the bottom of the painting, which if you looked at first glance, you might just think it's kind of a stray line or a sketch, but it's actually the feet peeking through. And he did not, there are other areas of this that he painted out more thoroughly, but he kind of left these kind of peeking out at you. And again, I hope I don't ruin this, but when you look at this in the galleries, you can't not see those feet once you know they're there. And imagine the standing figure. And also, if you look at the surface, you can slightly make out other areas of the composition. The tall red vase that is also painted over. One of our more complex Picasso reworkings is 1921 Mother and Child, and this was painted when Picasso was fairly newly married to Olga Koklova, who was a Russian ballet dancer. And it was painted the year after they had had their son, Paolo. And he spent this summer of 1921 in the south of France at the ocean with the family. He was newly wealthy at this point. He had kind of, doing quite well with his career. So we have this lovely painting from 1901. But in 1968, a member of our board of trustees, William Hartman, went to visit Picasso in his studio in France, and he took him a book showing the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago, and Picasso said, "Oh, wait a minute, I've got a piece of your painting in my studio." And he pulled out this rolled strip of canvas and handed it to Mr. Hartman, and obviously this was a little bit of a surprise to him, as well as the museum when he brought it back. So it led to some further investigations on the painting. And sure enough, wrapped around the tacking edge on the left side of Mother and Child is another part of this male figure. So the conservators were still a little bit befuddled and x-rayed the two paintings together. And what we get is a completely different composition. In this case, Picasso started out painting on a much larger canvas, and it was three figures sitting by the seashore, a man, and he's extending his arm out, and I hope you can tell he's holding a small fish, and the fish is actually what the child is reaching up to. At some point, for reasons we still don't 100% know, he decided to change the composition and really radically changed the composition. The entire reading of this painting is different now. Like, this is a much more sort of playful family portrait, potentially, maybe somewhat biographical, since he was a newly married father at the beach with his son. But instead, what he turned it to is kind of a much more iconic and historic mother and child that is a completely different feeling. He cut part of the man out, folded a little bit of it over the edge, and interestingly kept that strip of the man for 40-something years, which, and this is a great topic of debate amongst Picasso scholars, so I will not go in, everyone has a theory. But what we've learned is Picasso really, it's really fascinating to think about what he was thinking as the course of painting this. And it really changes the feeling of the painting to know that the little boy was reaching up towards the fish, and it was a much more different sort of playful scene. And now it really is this kind of serene, peaceful mother and child moment that you read completely differently in the finished painting.
That concludes our program. Thank you so much, Kim and Allison.